Whenever two species interact, they can have positive or negative effects on one another. So for either species, that is, the interaction can be a good thing, which means that the numbers of that species will increase, or the interaction can be a bad thing. Its numbers will decrease. There are cases, for example, in which the interaction is bad for both species. This is one that actually confuses students sometimes. You look at this picture and you see, okay, the hyena is getting the food and the vultures aren't. So this interaction must be good for the hyena. In fact, that's wrong, because this hyena is having to expend precious time and energy chasing off the vultures that are trying to take the food, even if the vultures never actually get to eat some of that antelope carcass. So this interaction is bad for the hyena because it has to spend energy and time that it wouldn't otherwise spend. And it's bad for the vulture because if the hyena weren't there, the vultures would get to eat the food. That's a very useful way of thinking about the effect of interactions on one species or another. When you're wondering what effect the vultures have on the hyena, ask yourself, would the hyena be better off or worse off if the vultures weren't there? This is called competition. Competition is what occurs when two species are bad for one another, and it's basically always happening because they're competing over some resource that they both need. There are a few rules of thumb that you ought to know about competition, and one of them is right here. Competition is not always obvious. This, I believe, is spotted knapweed, this really pretty purple color here. You see this growing in amongst this grass. And even though it doesn't look like it, there's a vicious fight going on underground for soil nutrients. The way that the knapweed is winning this fight, by the way, is it's secreting poison into the soil. It's actually poisoning this grass so that it can take the nutrients that the grass would otherwise get. This is very bad for the grass, by the way. Obviously, though, some of the grass is surviving and it's taking some nutrients away from the knapweed, so this interaction is bad for everybody. Competition may not be direct. There's another thing that you have to remember. Here's a sea lion devouring an adult salmon way off the coast of Alaska. If the sea lions off the coast eat enough salmon, bears hundreds of miles inland may starve to death. Similarly, if the bears eat too many salmon, the sea lions may starve. So these two species are competing with one another, even though they never ever come in contact. The third thing that is often overlooked is that competition is not usually symmetrical. What that means is that one competitor is usually superior. Competition usually has a much bigger harmful effect on one species than on the other. Here's an example that I've gotten to see many times out in Southern California. These are Argentine ants, an invasive species. They're shown here attacking a native harvester ant. It looks like the harvester ant has a big advantage here because it's huge, but in fact it doesn't. The Argentine ants are very aggressive, and smaller ants actually often have an advantage because they can overwhelm and destroy a single larger ant. It is true that the harvester ants have a slight negative effect on the Argentine ants, but on the whole, this is a really asymmetrical relationship. The Argentine ants really decrease the numbers of the harvester ants, and the reverse effect is really kind of weak. Because competition tends to be harmful, evolutionarily, species tend to move away from it. So over evolutionary time, species tend to evolve to use different resources. Here's an example of this. This is, I believe, the medium ground finch, Geospiza fuliginosa. And here's the major ground finch, I think is the name. It's Geospiza fortis. There are some islands in the Galapagos where you'll find just one of these two species. So here you find the major ground finch on Daphne Island. On the island of Los Hermanos, you find only the medium ground finch. On those islands, the birds are pretty much the same size. In particular, their beaks are pretty much the same size. Here, the medium ground finch feeds on seeds that are very small and very large because it's got this medium-sized beak. Here on Daphne, the major ground finch feeds on small and large seeds. What's interesting, though, is that there are some islands, like Santa Maria and San Cristobal, where the two species are found together. And on those islands, they've evolved to be different from one another. The medium groundfinch has evolved this much smaller bill, and it specializes on small seeds. The major groundfinch has evolved a much larger bill, and it specializes on the larger seeds. Why did this happen? Well, the individuals that were here in the middle suffered from a lot of competition with the opposite species. And so they had a hard time getting enough food and making a lot of little finches. So over time, what happened is that natural selection favored the smaller medium ground finches, and it favored the larger major ground finches, until the two populations sort of pushed away from one another, and they now occupy different niches. This is very common. Often you'll find similar species using slightly different resources, especially if they're found in the same area. And the reason is that competition between species can be fierce, and the species tend to evolve to avoid it.